actual justice warrior. He says that Carl Kalinske and Crystal Ball simp for communist Cuba. Man, that sounds terrible. How could anyone ever simp for communist Cuba? I'm sure he's got some amazing arguments about this that are going to prove everything they say wrong and BTFO them with facts and logic, as, you know, your average conservative YouTuber tends to do in a very thorough fashion with tons of facts and logic. So let's check that out.
And salutations, everybody. Today I want to talk about Cuba because, as you may have heard, there's been a massive protest movement across the country. These are the first significant protests in decades because Cuba is a repressive communist regime that doesn't allow protest.
Oh, so the reason that these are the first protests in decades is because it's a repressive communist regime, you know, but that doesn't make much sense because protests happen literally everywhere, regardless of how repressive the supposed regime is. So yeah, you think maybe there's other reasons why there might not have been many protests in Cuba? Like maybe people didn't want to protest. You know, I get it. It's difficult to understand as an American who hates protests there all the time, especially with how common they are, that you know, maybe people in Cuba are a lot happier than your completely zero knowledge brain thinks. It's possible, but, you know, not going to look into it at all. Just has his pre-made conclusion up and ready for this country that he literally couldn't point to on a map. So we're already got a good start.
And of course, this has brought out people in the United States that are simping for the communist regime. As they say, when something's going wrong.
These are pro-government protests, by the way. You can tell from the 26th of July movement flags.
That's not real socialism.
These are pro-government. This is from Miami, not Cuba.
Or it's America's fault. So, of course, are totally not communists in the
Miami.
Alternative media, people who just...
His examples of protests in Cuba, a lot of them are from Miami, and a lot of them are also from pro-government rallies. So, interesting stuff.
Scandinavian model are talking about how this is all due to America forcing food shortages. Now, we're going to get into this, but first, we got to hear from our sponsor, which is related to food shortages. Great transition. Friends, it seems like big government and tech giants...
Oh my god, this guy's generic Trumpoid conspiracy theorist who's selling fucking prepper stuff. Typical shit, man.
These people are waving our flag. They're demanding freedom.
This is a protest from Miami. They're not waving your flag. These people are in the USA. This is literally the fucking USA. You can tell just by looking at it. It's the most obvious fucking picture of the fucking USA imaginable. This is your example of Cubans waving the US flag in Cuba? Give me a fucking break.
Demanding COVID-19 vaccines. They're demanding more food. And of course, this has led a lot of people on the left to be uncomfortable because they are typically in favor of protests in theory, but they love communist dictatorships. Think of Bernie Sanders talking about how awesome Cuba was, which, by the way, great strategy by the Sanders campaign to do that right before the Florida Democratic primary. And I'm not being hyperbolic about this, and I'm not being hyperbolic about how widespread this is among the mainstream media. Get a load of this Reuters headline that I actually saw about how the Cuban protesters, the people protesting the communist regime, are actually going to exacerbate the COVID-19 pandemic. Funny how that works. If you're a Black Lives Matter rioter and you're aligned with Marxists and you're destroying private businesses, killing people...
Also, I mean, if there's property destruction, does that make the protest bad? Because in Cuba, they destroyed tons of property. But anyway, why is he bringing up BLM all of a sudden? What the fuck does that have to do with the Cuban protests?
Ruining people's lives because you're promoting a racial...
Like, no one is against the protest because of COVID. That's not why people are against them. Okay, it just took like one headline from Reuters, which is apparently to him like some sort of communist propaganda organization. What world does this guy live in? What the fuck did the BLM protest have to do? These are different people. These aren't even the same fucking people. Does he think, is Reuters public health officials in the USA? What are you talking about?
Agenda that is anti-American, then all of a sudden you don't spread the virus. But if you're protesting Cuba under the threat of an actually authoritarian government, an actual communist nightmare health...
I guarantee you most of the fucking libs who support like BLM protests and shit in the US also support the Cuban protests. Being against the Cuban government is a bipartisan thing in the US, but these fucking dumbasses don't know anything even about their own politics because this guy's doesn't know a single fucking thing about the world. Even in his own country, he obviously doesn't know shit. But the second that You leave those borders, it's just all like a mush of like whatever random like propaganda he happens to have offhandedly consumed.
Escape, then all of a sudden you're spreading the virus. Funny how that works. Funny how the virus tends to have political affiliations, which is interesting because the Cuban government has totally botched this virus protection rollout. But that's just the hypocrisy that is
virus protection rollout.
Tip of the iceberg, because our totally not supportive of communist dictatorship friends Kyle Kulinski and Crystal Ball also have their own hot takes about how the US is actually responsible for the suffering in Cuba. So let's hear about this from them.
So there's a number of things to say. First of all, if you watch his entire segment, he doesn't mention the US embargo on Cuba once. He doesn't mention it. And I have to say, anybody who's talking about the issue of Cuba and they don't bring up the embargo, they're either incredibly ignorant on the facts, or they're stupid, or they're lying to you for ideological reasons.
All of those loudly screaming that we must do something to support the Cuban people, I completely agree. We should do the something that is directly in our power and purview, which is to immediately remove the brutal sanctions that have fueled shortages and are especially murders during a pandemic.
The protests were very clear. There's a shortage of food, there's a shortage of medical supplies. They want more food, they want more medical supplies. If the US lifts the embargo, that would instantly help the people of Cuba. It's not an opinion, that's a fact.
Yeah,
so,
it would.
To not bring that up and to pretend like, oh no, it's all just they're protesting for freedom and democracy.
What are with these Zooms? Does he think that
That's your
he's owning them
interpretation.
with the Zooms?
When they said up front, immediately, the very first thing was shortage of food and shortage of medical supplies.
It's the embargo, you guys. The Americans are doing an embargo on Cuba, and that is causing all the problems within the Cuban government. It's not totally about the communism. Don't even talk about the communism. Ignore the communism. Ignore the people in Cuba.
So it's about the communism? The communism?
That are also demanding freedom. No. It's all...
Are they demanding freedom? I mean, what are the people in like the bigger government rallies demanding?
About the embargo. It's all about the United States strangling the Cubans off from food and prescription drug imports. Really, it is definitely true. And listen to Crystal Ball talk about how we have a solution to that problem.
Wait, he didn't refute what they said at all. He's just like saying what they were saying, but in a mocking tone. Is that an argument? Is an argument like when you just like say what your opponents are saying, but like in a mocking way? Did he just disprove them with facts and logic? You're gonna have to do more to prove that the embargo has no effect than just like saying, oh shit, they think that it's all the embargo. They didn't even mention the communism. Buddy, it doesn't fucking matter if you think communism is good or not. Obviously, the embargo is gonna have an effect whether communism is good or not. Like, if you take any look at like the estimates for what Cuba loses to the embargo, the Cuban government estimates, for example, 1 trillion. 1 trillion. Across what, 60 years? So let's say 1 trillion divided by 60. But that's like what, 16 billion? So let's say we take 16 billion. What's Cuba's yearly GDP? Okay, so if Cuba is losing 16 billion due to the embargo per year, that would mean that it's losing like 15% of its gross national wealth, minimum. So you can say the embargo on Cuba is depressing its economy by 15%, basically. So what that would mean is that it's clearly having an effect. It doesn't matter if Cuba has a terrible communist system that you hate, that is terrible. This would be making it worse. And clearly, you know, since Cuba hasn't had this crisis, wasn't having this sort of crisis beforehand, that has spurred protests, something has changed, okay? So even with the embargo, you know, people were not having these problems that spurred the protests before. So something has changed, which would be the pandemic. So clearly, at least in the short term, the factor here that has caused the problems is the COVID-19 pandemic, which my friend here doesn't seem to want to acknowledge because I think he's one of the conservatives who likes to downplay its effect on everything possible. But yeah, it's like, it doesn't matter if you think communism is good or bad. It's a matter of fucking reality. Putting an embargo on a country, you know, your main trading partner, putting an embargo on you, or your main geographical trading partner, putting an embargo on you that not only impedes trade from that country in every single respect, including food and medicine, by the way, the exemptions don't matter. I've gone over this in another video of mine that I made recently, which explained how the exemptions are only there for PR purposes, and that in practice, the US still barely gives out exemptions for food and medicine. So not only is trade impeded between the US and Cuba, it's also impeded between Cuba and every other country in the world because the US tries to impede it, right? If any company that does business with Cuba has to choose between Cuba and the USA, you're not allowed to have like financial assets in the USA if you trade with Cuba. You're not allowed to do business in the USA if you also trade with Cuba. So it's enforced extraterritorially as well, and obviously most countries are going to want to trade with the US over Cuba because the US is a huge economy and also one of the world's financial hubs. So to say that that has no fucking effect on the Cuban economy Like, it doesn't make things worse. It's obviously ludicrous. And his argument against it was just this, like, literal, like, juvenile shit where he just repeats what they said back to them in like a mocking
the
tone.
Americans are doing an embargo on Cuba, and that is causing all the problems within the Cuban government. It's not totally about the communism. Don't even talk about the communism. Ignore the communism. Ignore the people in Cuba that are also definitely true, and listen to Crystal Ball talk about how we have a solution to that problem.
It's childish. It doesn't fucking matter if you think communism is good or not. The embargo obviously has a market effect on the Cuban economy. In turn, then obviously has an effect on the welfare of human beings, okay? And if you don't believe me on that point, well, I have fucking news for you, because the US government admitted that was the point of the embargo when they were implementing it in the first place back in the 60s, back in the late 50s. Old Faithful, the source where they straight up fucking said when recommending the embargo that is what they want. The only foreseeable means of alienating internal support for the Communist Party is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. So it follows that every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba. If such a policy is adopted, it should be the result of a positive decision which would call forth a line of action which, as adroit as inconspicuous as possible, makes the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of the government. So right fucking there, your own fucking government, upon implementing the embargo, straight up said, yep, we're doing this because we want to cause suffering. We want to make people suffer as much as we possibly can, so that things there get so bad that they end up overthrowing the government, right? Because it's the only choice that they have left. And this fucking guy, just denying apparently that the embargo has any effect. Where does he even get this shit from? He like a 45-year-old man who thinks that just like responding to people by repeating their argument back at them is a gotcha. Like, what the fuck, man?
In the suffering of that nation.
I want to break this down because I think it's incredibly important that we talk about this. Not recognizing patent laws is not going to increase the supply of vaccines. India is doing
Okay, I'm interested in seeing what he says for this one.
One of the worst jobs of any country in the world, and India notoriously does not recognize patent laws. And one of the funniest things about these lefties is they'll talk about how India is brave in standing up to Big Pharma in their non-recognition of patent laws.
Who has ever talked about how brave India is and standing up to Big Pharma? Like, is your evidence for this like a random headline from the fucking Guardian? I've never heard anyone talk about how brave India is, especially since India literally has a right-wing fascist government currently.
But then they'll also talk about how there's a shortage of vaccines in India because of those same patent laws. Again, these companies produce this with high-end technology that cannot be replicated by nations that seek to knock them off. On top of that...
What? Wait. No. Some of the most advanced production in the world is located in the third world, because that's where it's outsourced to. The world's biggest vaccine producer is Indian, for one. The Serum Institute of India is an Indian-owned company that manufactures vaccines in India, which is the world's biggest vaccine manufacturer. And I'll have you know that they're also manufacturing vaccines in India. They are manufacturing a variant of the AstraZeneca vaccine in India. So this guy has no fucking clue what he's talking about, for one. For two, why the fuck are we talking about vaccines in India? Why the fuck are you talking about vaccines in India? This doesn't have shit to do with anything. Not only is he wrong about the fact that, about his idea that like these countries couldn't just take patents and put them into production. They absolutely could. They have the pre-existing infrastructure, not just India, but also Cuba. Okay? Cuba obviously has vaccine producing infrastructure because they've produced millions of doses of their own vaccines already on the island. So, you know, maybe if these patents had been waived, especially much earlier, like say, late last year, Cuba wouldn't have had to develop its own vaccines, and it could have just taken these patents and started manufacturing them in its own country, because it already has this supposed high-tech vaccine-producing infrastructure that this guy thinks it doesn't in the country, obviously, because it literally produces its own COVID vaccines already. You don't fucking believe me? Well, let's look at Cuba's vaccine rollout, okay? Cuba has applied 9 million doses, okay? Almost all of those have been produced in the country itself. This idea that these countries cannot produce vaccines, where does he even get it from? And why is he even focusing so much on this patent thing? Like, he for one, he didn't refute anything about the embargo, like exacerbating Cuba's issues, which it obviously does. Obviously, right? Impeding trade between between like the US and Canada, for example, would also cause huge economic issues, particularly for Canada because it's a smaller country. It doesn't matter if Canada was socialist or free market capitalist, it would cause problems. But two, like, he's just wrong in every fucking sense. He didn't deal with the point about the embargo and immediately moved on to some tangent about vaccines in India. And even there, he's wrong.
All of these people seem to be ignoring that Cuba is not being denied vaccines by the United States of America. In fact, the Cuban government themselves have refused the vaccines. And a couple of months ago, the mainstream media...
They haven't refused the vaccines. They didn't buy vaccines from these US companies. Do you think there might be a reason for that?
...was celebrating this decision from the Cuban government.
Okay.
You have glorious headlines and articles about how...
It's weird how, like, factual reporting on what's happening in Cuba, like, Cuba, is developing its own vaccines. That's true. Cuba's vaccine rivals these vaccines. That's true. These are all just factual statements, okay? This is not celebration. This guy, like, takes news outlets simply reporting on what's happening in Cuba as an endorsement of whatever that is, as, like, them simping for Cuba. He's offended at the very notion that people are talking about things that are happening in Cuba, aside from protests against the government. It's very weird.
Glorious headlines and articles about how Cuba is thumbing their nose at Big Pharma, how they refuse to join the COVAX program, which is a program by the World Health Organization to get...
So let's say, why is it that Cuba might not want to buy US vaccines? Why is it that Cuba might have taken the decision to manufacture their own vaccines? Do you think it's because they have a lot of experience maybe with the embargo, impeding medicine imports into Cuba, impeding their ability to negotiate with US pharmaceutical companies? Do you think that might have had something to do with that decision? Do you think Cuba might have decided not to buy Moderna and not to buy Pfizer or Johnson & Johnson or whatever other vaccines are being produced in the US? Do you think maybe the reason for that is because Cuba has been impeded from freely buying US pharmaceuticals by the embargo for 3 decades now, ever since the Cuban Democracy Act was passed in the early 1990s. Do you think that might be a reason for it? They already have this experience with issues importing pharmaceuticals and medicine from the US, so they decided, well, instead of trying that, we'll work on our own vaccines. Okay, I have a spoiler for you. Yes, the reason they are developing their own vaccines is not because they want to stick it to the man or anything. It's because they don't have the fucking option. They literally do not have the option as other countries do to negotiate on equal footing with these these pharmaceutical companies that do business with the US or that are based in the US or that produce vaccines in the US. They don't have the right to these sorts of equal sort of negotiations due to the embargo. Okay, and I've gone over this in another video of mine. I'll just put a source on this fucking screen to show you what I mean. When the Cuban Democracy Act, which is the thing that on paper had exemptions for food and medicine, was passed in the early 90s, and which actually impeded them, the Inter-American Human Rights Commission put out a statement saying that the bureaucratic requirements make these exemptions virtually impossible, okay? And there was another source that I listed from a book on the Cuban embargo under international law saying that the humanitarian exemption on paper actually has a system of license application that has deterred US companies from even applying, given the rejection of numerous applications on the ground that the proposed exports would be detrimental to US foreign policy interests. Okay, so what you have there is Cuba making an informed decision on how it's going to vaccinate its people based on its experience with the embargo. Like, if you think that the Cuban government wouldn't fucking absolutely love to be able to buy vaccines from the USA or to be able to just not have to go to the trouble of developing their own vaccines and being able to use the European and the US ones for manufacture in their own country, they would have fucking loved that. This is not some ideologically based sticking it to the man decision. It's a practical one. A very easily understandable practical one because they do not have the option to buy from these US-based companies. And also, that vaccine rollout isn't even bad. Like, let's look at Cuba's performance on vaccines, okay? So they have about 6 million people who have received 1 dose. That's about, 60, 70% of the population, 20% completely vaccinated. You compare that to, like, fucking, its neighbors like Jamaica, 4% completely vaccinated, 300,000 doses. Like, the neighbors over here, for example, are doing fucking awful. Mexico, 18% completely vaccinated. Even Argentina, which is doing relatively well for being such a big country, only 13% fully vaccinated. Like, in Latin America, Cuba is punching above its weight in terms of vaccine rollout with a vaccine that is almost completely produced in
Attention,
Cuba.
Westerners.
Okay. Point is, Cuba's not doing particularly bad on its vaccine rollout. It's pretty middling, mid to high level, or mid, sort of middle, slightly better than middle ranking in terms of vaccine rollouts in Latin America. Okay. And this is all with a locally produced vaccine. Obviously, that would have been better. It would have been better if Cuba had access to US patents and without having to wait to develop their own vaccines, which obviously they have less of a capacity to do purely by virtue of being a smaller country. Surely Cuba would be doing better on vaccines without the embargo impeding its ability to purchase all foreign vaccines, not just US vaccines, but also foreign vaccines. Still not doing too bad. But it doesn't matter how much of an effect you think the embargo has. It obviously has an effect. It's impossible to say that it doesn't. Guy's a dumbass. Let's continue.
Vaccines out to third world countries that would have trouble affording them. And the reason why is because the Cuban government had decided that they were going to make their own vaccines. And not only were they going to do this according to the mainstream media and save
They literally have done that. They have done that.
their own population
What are you talking about, the mainstream media? What world does this guy live in where the US mainstream media is supportive of the Cuban government? They fucking hate Cuba. Fucking dumbass conservatives live in a different world.
without big
Like they just see people. This guy sees the mainstream media just matter-of-factly acknowledging that something is happening in Cuba in them manufacturing their vaccines, and he sees that as evil communist propaganda by itself.
pharma, but they were also going to distribute those vaccines to other nations in the world for low cost or nearly free of charge because that's how amazing the Cuban government was. All of a sudden,
Cuba has been exporting a lot of vaccines, particularly to Venezuela. Okay, so they're doing that as well. Everything that this guy is saying that they're apparently not doing, they are actually doing. So he's not even on his random vaccine tangent, he's just losing. It makes no sense.
those people who were cheering the Cuban government's decision months ago don't want to talk about it. They just want to talk about the US government embargoing vaccines when the US government is distinctly not embargoing vaccines
It literally embargoes medical products, as I just showed, with those two sources that acknowledge how it does it.
from the Cuban government. They chose that for themselves.
Isn't he talking about patent laws here? His rant was based on that woman saying something about patent laws. And as I said, if there were no patents on these vaccines, Cuba wouldn't have even had to develop its own vaccine, and it could have started production of these patented vaccines earlier without having to first wait to develop its own vaccines, which it has two of now. So,
And these are the
nonsensical.
consequences of that. Also, it's really funny how all these people are anti-free trade. They call
And also, no, the Cuba protests have little to do with the vaccine rollout there. More to do with the economic crisis caused by the COVID pandemic, which has, impeded trade and depressed economies the world over, with a particularly strong effect in Cuba, particularly because it's so vulnerable to interruption to tourism, for one, and also because, the embargo is also obviously a huge effect, as we went over earlier. According to if we use the Cuban government's estimates, it would be about 15% of total GDP. That's fucking huge, right? That's enough to cause an immediate economic crisis in basically any country in the world, losing 15% of your GDP. But let's go back to his new tangent here.
and these are the consequences of that. Also, it's really funny how all these people are anti-free trade. They call trading with third world countries exploitation of those third world countries. But now, because the US government won't trade with Cuba, aka they won't exploit Cuba, that's a huge problem.
What? No one thinks that trade by itself is exploitative. No one in the entire fucking world. All countries have to trade. Practically almost no country has the capacity to produce everything that it needs by itself, aside from really big ones, especially not a small country like Cuba. So, trade is naturally exploitative? What is he talking about? No one thinks that. Isn't this guy a massive Trumper as well? Trump is a massive protectionist. Trump is anti-free trade. Trump is anti-globalism, he calls neoliberalism. This guy's definitely a Trump supporter, right? Trump is a protectionist, dude. Is Trump a fucking socialist? Is Donald fucking Trump the massive fucking protectionist who like constantly talks about how other countries are taking advantage of the USA with unfair trade deals, aka exploitation? Is he a socialist now because he's apparently anti-free trade? Is that what the definition of socialism and communism are? To be anti-free trade? For one, free trade means very different things inside a country versus outside of it, okay? The problem that Cuba has with the embargo is that it doesn't have the freedom to trade with who it chooses, okay? That's not the same thing as unregulated trade coming in from going in and coming out. There's no country in the world that has truly unregulated trade. Not even close. Cuba's problem with the embargo is that it doesn't have the freedom to negotiate with who it wants because of the embargo. in the way that I explained earlier, the way that the embargo impedes his ability to do so. That doesn't mean that like you have to be ideologically like supportive of free market capitalism, because trading is a fundamental thing that has existed before capitalism even existed, before anyone had even uttered the word communism. Like, it's a necessity. How is it naturally by default exploitative, right? It's not by default exploitative to trade. Like, if Cuba went and negotiated with US companies like, a fair deal on them exporting vaccines to Cuba, for example, as a hypothetical, that would not be exploitation of Cuba. That would be Cuba just engaging in fucking normal everyday trade to get something that it needs. This guy's talking about it doesn't make sense. No one thinks this. It seems to me that he's mistaking the idea that like foreign ownership within a country is bad with the idea that trading by itself is bad, and that Cuba apparently wants to only be self-sufficient and not ever trade with anyone, which doesn't make any fucking sense because that's literally impossible. There's no one who thinks what this guy seems to be saying that they think they do. People don't, like, these people are just economically illiterate. This guy doesn't know what free trade even means. He doesn't know anything about supposed communism. He doesn't know how the world actually functions. He just has like these set phrases like, you're against the embargo? I thought you hate free trade, buddy. You're against free trade yourself. You're a fucking Trump supporter. Trump loves his tariffs, man. Is he a communist now? A government, for example, Cuba's government being selective about who it trades with is not the same thing as being against, having the ability to trade with other countries who it chooses. And obviously, the Cuban government being unable to trade with who it chooses due to the US not only not allowing trade between the US itself and Cuba, it also has effects on Cuba trade, even trading with a hypothetical company that has no business in the US and thus can't be affected by the embargo, because it means that there's less competition on the international market for that Cuban government contract or whatever, and it means that thus the Cuban government has to pay more. Fundamentally, from a very basic material standpoint, and if this guy had any understanding of economics, this sort of thing is obvious. Okay? Trade can be exploitative. Doesn't mean it's innately exploitative. And I don't think that anyone will think that the Cuban government, negotiating with a US company for food imports or whatever, would be exploitative in any sense, in any way, shape, or form. Nonsensical.
AKA, they won't exploit Cuba. That's a huge problem. Also,
this guy's in, it's the same fucking thing that he did earlier, right? Where it was just he just repeated, what they said. Oh, you think the embargo is bad. It has nothing to do with communism. Now it's like, this is what these people think. And now the embargo is a problem. I guess you support free market capitalism after all, which I myself don't even support because I'm a fucking Trump supporter. Like, this guy doesn't even have his own politics on lock, let alone is he in a position to critique those of others.
So again, this is not just the ideology of the idiot leftists in the United States of America. This is the ideology of the Cuban government. Remember what Crystal and Kyle said about how the embargo is limiting food and medicine into Cuba.
The protests were very clear. There's a shortage of food. There's a shortage of medical supplies. They want more food. They want more medical supplies. If the U.S. lifts the embargo...
By the way, I forgot to say also that the embargo obviously indirectly affects everything, even if we pretend the exemptions did anything. Because if you embargo Cuba, you inhibit its ability to trade, then Cuba obviously is less able to make money which would then be used to buy food and medicine and everything else. Obviously, these are basic things. If you look at a fucking embargo, anyone could look at this and tell you that this is going to happen. You have to be a complete fucking moron, as this guy obviously is, to not see it.
That would instantly help the people of Cuba. It's not an opinion. That's a fact.
Now, just to be clear, I am not somebody who blindly supports the embargo policy. We've been doing this for over 50 years, and it has not gotten rid of the Cuban regime. I'm for...
Oh, so he's for forcing people to suffer as long as it gets rid of the Cuban regime. Interesting.
More effective policies in order to get rid of the Cuban regime. And one of the reasons why the embargo is not very effective against Cuba is because Cuba already tariffs heavily and taxes heavily imports of food and medicine.
Cuba's tariffs are 9% average. Cuba's isn't even that high, right? 8% average tariff rate. Okay? Same as, for example, Brazil, which is not exactly a fucking left-wing country. It's not even a particularly high tariff rate for a poor country. Where is he getting this idea of heavy tariffs? Where is he getting this from? Is he going to show a source?
And soap from other nations. And you don't have to...
Wait, does he know that the US has tariffs, by the way? Trump loves the tariffs. Ask Trump about his tariffs on China. And by default, the US also has tariffs on practically every import to the US, so nonsensical.
to take my word for it because the president of Cuba has announced temporary lifting of those import taxes until December 31st.
No, that's not what this says.
Until December 31st, 2021, in response to the protests.
That's not
So
what the
it's not the
headline
US
says.
government doing a Mac Jedi freaking mind trick on the Cuban government, making them do that. They, like the left in this country, believe that international trade is exploitative.
No, they fucking don't. Where have they ever said that? Where have they ever said, oh, we think international trade is exploitative, so thank you for putting the embargo on us so that we can't do international trade. No one's ever said that. Look at this face. Wow, this. I'm going to screenshot this and make this an emoji on the stream. Perfect fucking frame. What he shows here, this headline, Cuba suspends tariffs on food and medicine that travelers bring to the island. That is customs duties on travelers, not on imports and exports, on things that people bring with them in their luggage. That is not a significant portion of food and medicine that is brought to Cuba at all. Not even the slightest. This is not nothing to do with trade. Nothing to do with trade at all. This is customs fees. Like, you enter the country and you have to pay a fee for stuff that you bring with you from outside of the country, right? These are not the same as tariffs on trade. In fact, with most of the Cuban government's main trading partners, especially on foodstuffs, they have no tariffs. Does this guy think that, like, most of the food in Cuba comes from people flying to Cuba with fucking luggage full of fucking Twinkies or something? No, dude. Most of the food and medicine in Cuba is imported by Cuban companies, most of which are government run. By far, 99.99999%. So this guy's idea that the Cuban government is impeding food and medicine imports itself through huge tariffs makes no fucking sense at all, because this barely changes anything. This is for people who are fucking coming to the island with shit in their luggage. It's not for normal trade. Your own headline explains it. Explains how you're wrong. Right there. Travelers bring to the island. And I'll bring up the tariff schedule of Cuba with Vietnam. Vietnam is a big food importer to Cuba. It imports a lot of its rice, for example, which is a big deal. So Cuba has, for example, a trade agreement with Vietnam. It gives it 0% tariffs on most food imports. The only food imports which have tariffs are food that Cuba produces a huge amount of relatively to its consumption in its own country, okay? Most of the tariffs are 0%. And even the base tariff isn't even that high, like 10%, okay? 0%, 0%, 0%. Cuba literally has trade deals, okay, with its big food import partners, okay? And I absolutely guarantee you that without the embargo, Cuba would absolutely fucking love to make a trade deal on medicine and food with the USA, eliminating almost all tariffs on food and medicine products, because Cuba is a tiny island nation that has to import a lot of these things because it just doesn't have the capacity. Most island nations in the Caribbean have to do this. So his idea that Cuba has some incredibly huge tariffs that are impeding itself from being able to import food and medicine because apparently it's a suicidal government that just loves people to not have food and medicine make no sense whatsoever. His idea of a source is just like putting a fucking headline on the screen that doesn't say what he's saying it does. Anyway.
Of those import taxes until December 31st, 2021 in response to the protests. So it's not the US government doing a Mac Jedi freaking mind trick on the Cuban government, making them do that. They, like the left...
No, the embargo is still there. You haven't addressed the embargo at fucking all. You're just like saying, what about these other things that are essentially totally inconsequential when compared to like Cuba not being able to trade on its own terms or on fair terms with the US and a lot of other foreign companies as well due to the US embargo.
In this country believe that international trade is exploitative, and in order to prop
they
up their
don't.
own
No one
industries,
believes
they
that.
heavily tax and restrict imports into their own country.
No
We
one
didn't trick
believes
them
that
into doing
international trade
That's
is by
something that the
default
Cuban government
exploitative. Jesus,
did
man.
themselves, and that is far more responsible for the shortages because the US embargo on Cuba is a US embargo on Cuba, but the restrictions on imports of food, medicine, and soaps and other hygiene supplies are restrictions that apply to anybody trying to bring supplies back into Cuba.
I just addressed that, and I already addressed before the fact that the US does factually impede imports from the US and other countries too. Again, you can see right here in the article that he's citing, brought to the island by travelers. How much food do you think is brought to the island by travelers, man? What the fuck is wrong with you?
So when Crystal and Kyle talk about the embargo as if it is the most important factor in what's going on in...
I mean, he's saying that the embargo is less important to Cuba's food supply than people bringing suitcases of food into the island when they go there to visit their family or to do tourism. Buddy, I think you might be a little bit wrong there. I think actually you might be wrong by like a couple of million orders of magnitude as to the relative significance of these two things.
Cuba right now, and they talk about how the US government is preventing Cuba from getting vaccines, and how the US government is preventing Cuba from getting food, and how the US government is preventing Cuba from getting sanitation supplies, medicine, etc. That is just not the case. The Cuban government, based on their communist ideology of protecting their workers within their own country from competition from foreign nations, because remember, communists don't believe in free trade, are preventing or severely limiting those.
This guy literally like, his thing is like, these people are being hypocritical for these things that I completely fail to prove in any way. And also this thing that they apparently believe, which they don't believe at all. Like everything that he's saying is just completely wrong. From the supposed facts that he's using to prove his points down to the beliefs that he's ascribing to his supposed opponent.
Those supplies from entering the nation. That's just the fact. But again, the simps for the communist regime don't want to tell you that because they support communism. I don't know how much more clear to make this. They are anti-American. And one of the worst things that I saw in Kyle Kalinski's video talking about this was Kyle referencing how the pro-government supporters in Cuba are even bigger, or at least as big, as the protests against the communist government of Cuba.
And by the way, Ben omits what? There are now pro-government protests that are just as big as the anti-government ones. But he omits that. So he's going to omit everything that doesn't fit his narrative. That's what Ben Shapiro does.
Now remember, the big premise of Kyle Kalinski's video where he's attacking Ben Shapiro for supposedly not disclosing that the American embargo on Cuba is causing all of these problems is the fact that Ben Shapiro is hiding information. You know what doesn't appear at all in Kyle Kalinski's video where he's sucking up to the Cuban dictatorship, to the Communist Party of Cuba? That the president of
God, could this guy like be any more of like a just using like the you know the terms that like cause the endorphins to go off in his audience, like the communist regime, the dictatorship, you know, that makes them be like, oh man, I love this guy. He's confirming what the US media tells me.
Cuba ordered Communist Party members to get out into the streets and fight back against the protesters. So yeah, the side that is being called to action by the Cuban government is
Wait, Trump has supported protests and shit like that too. Why are the pro-government protests invalid if the government says that people should go out and rally? Was Trump's support invalid because he held rallies, literal rallies?
The side, the communists and the military, are coming out in force and attacking the people who are demanding a system that provides food.
Well, I mean, by the time he made this, these protests were over like literally a week earlier, so.
Medicine, and all these other problems free of the communist dictatorship. So yeah, Kyle, really, really great job. Ben Shapiro is the one.
This guy's just one of the dumbest fuckers I've ever seen. Like it's really funny to me how like he's accusing others of being hypocritical with their beliefs, which he ascribes to them, which they obviously don't even hold. When he was a fucking Trump supporter, Trump held pro-government rallies all the time when he was a president. When he was the president, yet apparently, if the president holds a pro-government rally in Cuba, that's invalid. Trump is a massive protectionist. He's explicitly against free trade, both in his rhetoric and in his practice. But now, apparently, if you put in some tariffs, you're a communist, you're a socialist. That's what that means, which this guy's obviously against. Like, funnily enough, I don't even need to make a straw man of him because these are his beliefs. He's doing exactly what he's saying that these other people are doing, except they're not actually doing it, and he is.
Leaving stuff out, even though you have left out all of the key factors that have led to this crisis in Cuba. One of the left's absolute favorite phrases when referring to people on the right is they call something a mask-off moment. This Cuba situation is a mask-off moment for the left wing in the media and on the online media. They are supportive of communist dictatorships. If they see a problem in the world, they immediately look for a reason to blame the United States of America, and they will leave out every single crucial detail relating to...
You didn't prove any of that. Like, pretty much everything that you cited was just explicitly wrong.
To the crises, in order to highlight something that's basically irrelevant as long as they can tie it to...
The embargo is basically irrelevant? I mean, you cited travelers bringing in food and medicine as a huge cause of shortages. If travelers have to pay like 10% more when they bring food and medicine through custom, now that is the real cause of a lack of medicine and food, not the fucking literal trade embargo with Cuba's biggest geographical neighbor and the world's biggest economy. Not at all. That embargo is a non-factor compared to some guy bringing in some fucking Cadbury chocolate bar in his fucking carry-on when entering Cuba. Unbelievable shit, man. How did he ever arrive at the idea that he has any clue what he's talking about?
Cuban government, for the final time, tariffs food imports, not just from other nations, but from private people sending food to their families from other Latin American countries. The Cuban government tariffs medicine, they tariff hygiene supplies, and it was the Cuban government, not the United States government, that refused vaccines from Big Pharma because they believed that they would be able to produce the vaccines better and distribute them to Latin America because they thought it was a big propaganda.
I mean, I already fucking went over how that's bullshit. They manufacture their own vaccines out of necessity because the embargo requires them to do it. If you had given them the patents fucking in like December or October, they would have been manufacturing the US or European or developed vaccines. They wouldn't have needed to develop their own vaccines. They obviously have the manufacturing capacity in Cuba because they're literally manufacturing vaccines there. They've manufactured more than 10 million of them.
They wanted to take it to Big Pharma, and the consequences of these actions are seen in the streets in the nation of Cuba. The denial about...
For this guy, the reason that the protests are happening is because they wanted to take it to Big Pharma. People are protesting because of their relatively successful vaccine rollout. Is that why they're protesting? It might be something different. This guy is a complete NPC. He even looks like the NPC meme.
The basic facts that Cuba sucks because of communism, that socialism makes places worse, not better, is indicative of the denier rather than indicative.
That one also doesn't make any sense. Let's just look at the Cuba on the HDI index again. Cuba punches far above its weight in quality of life. So let's look at some capitalist countries. Haiti, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. They don't seem to be doing very good. And those are Cuba's most immediate neighbors. Belize, Bolivia, Paraguay, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Mexico. These are all explicitly capitalist countries under Cuba on this relatively decent measure of standard of living, okay? So how is Cuba an example of the failure of socialism? Because it's having a temporary crisis. Capitalism fails every fucking 5 to 10 years. These people, like, they look at this like temporary economic crisis in Cuba, which is happening due to their pandemic, and also obviously partly due to the embargo. And he's just like, oh, this means that, you know, Cuba sucks. Cuba is failing. Socialism sucks. But if you look at the fucking ranks of quality of life in comparison, Cuba is in the top half in Latin America, and many countries with economic systems that this guy would approve of are doing worse than it. In some cases, far, far worse than it. So if Cuba is an example of the failure of socialism, it's a pretty fucking successful failure, buddy. The narrative that it has an economic crisis, like this is Cuba's second economic crisis in about 30 years, okay? That's a whole lot fewer economic crises than you've had in the US in that same time frame. So if having a temporary economic crisis is evidence of the failure of socialism, what are the far more numerous economic crises in the US and in many other capitalist, so-called capitalist countries? Are they indicative of failures of their system, or does it only apply to Cuba? Fair question, I think, that this guy obviously kind of answered.
Indicative of reality. But hey, those are just my thoughts, and they happen to be 100% accurate and factually based. But let me know your thoughts down in the comments.
They happen to be 100% accurate and factually based. Let's look at the facts that he's presented in this video. This was his factual refutation of the fact that the embargo has an effect on food and medicine in Cuba.
Guys, the Americans are doing an embargo on Cuba, and that is causing all the problems within the Cuban government. It's not totally about the communism. Don't even talk about the communism. Ignore the communism. Ignore the people in Cuba.
Oh man, such great facts you've got there, buddy. What other facts did he bring up? Him claiming that India doesn't have the facilities to manufacture vaccines, which is objectively false, because India is the world's biggest vaccine manufacturer that is also already manufacturing COVID vaccines as of like 8 fucking months ago. And he also said the same thing about Cuba, which is again objectively false, as you can tell from the fact that they're literally manufacturing COVID vaccines, you fucking dipshit. What other facts did he bring up? The fact that Cuba is manufacturing vaccines, yeah, and him completely mischaracterizing what, suspending customs duties on food and medicine being brought into the country by travelers means. And that's it. Literally nothing else. 100% factually based.
Going to be 100% accurate and factually based.
100% accurate and factually based. Well, even his own fucking sources don't even remotely say the things that he's saying they are. Doesn't even try to refute most of the points that these people were even making. Just like goes off on a tangent where he strawmans what they supposedly believe and says that he didn't actually try to say that the embargo doesn't have an effect on Cuba. All that he really said was that well, if the embargo is bad, what about travelers bringing Twinkies in their fucking suitcase? And also, if the embargo is bad, well, Don't you hate trade? Don't you hate free trade? None of that has anything to do with the embargo, with, the effect of the embargo or not. He didn't even try to refute it. I guarantee you what happened is that he did like a cursory Google of the effects of the embargo, didn't actually find anything that suited the narrative that it doesn't have an effect, so he just decided to like bring up completely inconsequential things, like travelers bringing in food and medicine in their suitcase, rather than systemic things like trade between the US and Cuba being hampered, along with the US also hampering trade between Cuba and the rest of the world any way that it possibly can. Everything that he said was wrong, as you would expect. At least stick to topics that you can claim to have some sort of idea about, because you clearly don't fucking have any clue about Cuba or anything outside of the US, okay? The number one thing that the world needs is for the Great Firewall around the US and an impenetrable dome around the US, so that we don't have to hear about ignorant American opinions anymore, regardless of whether they're on the left or the right. Like butting in and trying and talking about how factually and accurate, factually based and accurate the opinion that they formed literally 2 minutes ago on Cuba is complete NPC. That's my verdict on the actual justice warrior who just got completely BTFO. That stands for blown the fuck out, by the way. Destroyed. Epically. Epic style.